The air in the grand hall felt thick enough to chew. It was that special kind of quiet that only happens when a whole lot of people are holding their breath at the same time. Hundreds of velvet seats stretched back from the stage, all filled with parents, teachers, and music lovers, their faces lit by the warm glow of the stage lights. Up front, 3 young musicians sat on 3 simple, black benches, looking like islands in a sea of expectation. This was it, the final round of the National Young Musicians Competition, and the tension was so high you could almost see it shimmering above the audience. In the front row, a little girl wiggled in her seat. Her name was Clara, and she was 8 years old. The velvet dress her mom had picked out for her felt itchy against her skin, and the fancy bow in her hair felt like it was pulling her hair out. She was here for one reason, her big brother. He was 17 and one of the 3 finalists sitting on the stage. To everyone else, he was a brilliant pianist, a prodigy. To Clara, he was just her brother, the one who sometimes forgot to take out the trash and made funny faces at her across the dinner table. She loved him, of course, but she didn't always understand his world. His world was one of long practices, serious faces, and quiet rooms filled with notes that floated in the air. Her world was more about scraped knees, mud pies, and cartoons on a Saturday morning. The host, a man with a smile that looked a little too bright and a suit that was a little too shiny, walked to the center of the stage. He tapped the microphone, making a loud, thumping sound that made Clara jump. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Welcome to the final challenge. For years, our competitors have shown us what they can do with music they know. But a true master, a true artist, can understand music itself, even when it's a complete stranger." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in. Clara looked around at the audience. Everyone was leaning forward, their eyes wide. "This year," the host continued, "we introduced the Enigma round. We will play one piece of music, just one. Our finalists will have 5 minutes to tell us everything they can about it. Who wrote it? What period is it from? What is the structure of the piece? It's a test of not just skill, but of pure, raw musical understanding." A low murmur went through the crowd. This was harder than anyone had expected. On stage, Clara saw her brother's shoulders tense up. He was always so calm, so confident, but even he looked a little worried now. The other 2 finalists, a girl with a long, dark braid and a boy with glasses that kept slipping down his nose, both had the same look on their faces. It was the look of someone who had just been told they had to climb a mountain with no rope. At a long table to the side of the stage sat the 3 judges. They were the most important music people in the country, and they looked it. The woman in the middle was a famous violinist, and she sat perfectly still, like a statue. The man next to her was a modern composer, known for music that sounded like car crashes and sirens, and he was tapping his pen on the table, looking excited. But the one who caught everyone's attention was the man at the end, the head judge. His name was Dr. Alistair Finch, and he had a reputation for being tough, brilliant, and a little bit scary. He had eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a frown that was permanently carved onto his face. He had heard every piece of music ever written, or so it seemed. If he was stumped by something, it was because it was truly stumping. The host nodded to a technician in the back, and the lights in the hall dimmed even further, plunging the audience into near darkness. The only light was on the stage and on the 3 judges who looked like 3 kings about to pass judgment. A soft hum came from the speakers, and then the music began. It wasn't like any music Clara had ever heard before. It wasn't happy, and it wasn't sad. It was confusing. It sounded like a conversation between 2 people who were arguing, but then they would start whispering, and then one of them would start laughing, a strange, high-pitched laugh. The notes jumped all over the place, never landing where you thought they would. It felt like trying to walk on a floor that was constantly moving. Clara imagined a stormy sea, with waves that were black and angry, crashing against rocks. But then, in the middle of the storm, there would be a tiny moment of quiet, a little sliver of a beautiful melody, like a single seagull flying peacefully in the sky. But just as quickly as it appeared, it would be gone, swallowed up by the crashing waves again. She looked at her brother on stage. His face was a blank slate. He was staring at the piano in front of him as if it had just turned into a giant, scary monster. The girl with the braid was shaking her head slowly, a tiny, almost invisible movement. The boy with his glasses had pushed them up on his head and was rubbing his eyes, completely lost. Then Clara looked at the judges. This was the real show. The famous violinist had a look of deep concentration on her face, her head tilted to one side, as if she was trying to untangle a knot with her ears. The modern composer was smiling now, a weird, excited smile like he was watching a fireworks display. But it was Dr. Finch who was the most interesting to watch. At first, he had his usual stern frown on. He picked up his pen, ready to write down his thoughts, but then his hand stopped. He listened for a few more seconds, and a small wrinkle appeared between his eyebrows. He put his pen down. He listened some more, and the wrinkle got deeper. He took off his glasses and started polishing them with a handkerchief, but his eyes never left the stage, as if he thought the music was hiding somewhere up there. He looked confused. It was a look that nobody had ever seen on his face before. The music went on for what felt like a very long time. It twisted and turned, it was loud, and then it was soft. It was ugly, and then, for just a second, it was breathtakingly beautiful. It was like a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, but none of them seemed to fit together. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The last note hung in the air for a moment, a tiny, lonely sound, and then there was silence, a heavy, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your own heartbeat sound like a drum. In the darkness, no one moved, no one coughed, no one breathed. It was as if the music had been so strange that it had frozen everyone in place. The 5-minute clock appeared on a large screen, its red numbers a stark contrast to the darkness. 5 o'clock, 4:59, 4:58. On stage, the 3 finalists just sat there. They looked like statues, their faces pale in the dim light. No one picked up a pen. No one wrote a single note on the paper in front of them. The audience watched, their own hearts pounding in sympathy. They were all stumped. The music was a riddle with no answer. At the judges' table, the silence was just as deep, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of complete and total bafflement. Dr. Finch had put his glasses back on, but he wasn't looking at the contestants. He was looking at the other 2 judges, and he slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook his head. The other 2 judges shook their heads in return. They had nothing. They had heard centuries of music combined, thousands of compositions, but this was from another planet. The jury was stumped, completely and utterly stumped. The competition had come to a dead stop, right in the middle of its biggest moment. The silence that followed the music was heavier than the music itself. It was a thick, suffocating blanket thrown over the entire hall. The only movement was the glowing red clock on the big screen, its numbers ticking away with a cruel, steady rhythm. 4:47, 4:46, 4:45. Each second that passed was like a small hammer blow to the confidence of everyone on that stage. The 3 finalists, who just moments ago had been the brightest young stars in the country, now looked like 3 lost children in a dark forest. The paper in front of them was as white and empty as a field of snow. Not a single word, not a single note had been written. On the far left, the boy with the glasses was a picture of pure frustration. He had pushed his glasses up onto his forehead and was now rubbing his eyes so hard it must have hurt. His brain was a calculator, and he was trying to solve a problem that had no numbers. He kept hearing the weird time signatures in his head, a beat of 3, then a beat of 5, then a beat of 2, all jumbled together. He tried to tap it out with his foot, but his leg just twitched awkwardly. He was a builder who had been given a pile of beautiful, strange-shaped blocks, but with no instructions on how they fit together. The more he tried to force them, the more they fell apart. A tiny bead of sweat trickled down his temple, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, his face a mask of defeat. In the middle, the girl with the long dark braid was a statue of stillness. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but if you looked closely, you could see her fingers twisting around each other, a tiny, nervous dance. Her world was one of precision and beauty. She played the violin, and for her, music was about clean lines, perfect intonation and telling a clear story. But this music was a mess. It was a story told in a language she didn't understand, with scribbles and cross-outs and angry shouts. She couldn't find the melody, couldn't find the heart of it. It was like trying to find a single, straight thread in a tangled ball of yarn. She kept her eyes fixed on the music stand in front of her, as if she hoped the answer would magically appear there, but all she saw was her own pale, worried reflection. And then there was Clara's brother. He sat at the grand piano, his hands resting on the keys, but he wasn't playing. He was just staring. His mind, usually a fast and powerful engine, felt like it had stalled. He was trying to grab onto something, anything, in that strange and confusing piece of music. Was it a fugue? No, the themes never came back the same way. Was it a sonata? No, there was no clear development, no resolution. It felt like a dream where you're trying to run, but your legs won't move. He was the one everyone expected to have the answer. His parents, his teacher, the entire audience, they were all looking at him. He could feel their eyes on his back, a heavy weight. He thought about all the years of practice, all the scales, all the theory he had learned. It was all useless. For the first time in his musical life, he felt completely and utterly lost. A wave of heat washed over his face, and he felt a prickle of shame. He let his hands fall from the keys into his lap, his shoulders slumping forward in a quiet admission of failure. The real drama, however, was unfolding at the judges' table. The three most respected minds in music were having a silent, panicked conversation with their own thoughts. The famous violinist, her posture still perfect, had a deep frown line etched between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. She was a performer, and she listened with her heart. She was trying to find the soul of the piece, the human emotion behind the notes. But all she felt was chaos. It was clever, yes, but it was cold. It was like a very complicated machine that did a lot of interesting things but had no purpose. She shook her head almost invisibly, a tiny gesture of profound disappointment. The modern composer, on the other hand, was thrilled and terrified at the same time. He loved the dissonance, the jarring chords, the rule-breaking. It was the kind of music he wished he had the courage to write. But the problem was, he couldn't figure out who did write it. It felt familiar, yet completely new. He scribbled a few notes on his pad, then crossed them out. He wrote down a name of famous avant-garde composer from the 1960s, then immediately scribbled it out. No, he whispered to himself, too melodic. He was like a detective who had found a perfect, beautiful footprint at a crime scene. But it didn't match any shoe he had ever seen, but it was Dr. Finch who was truly struggling. His entire life he had been the man with the answers. He could listen to 3 notes and tell you if it was a lost piece from a minor German composer in the 1750s. His brain was a library, and every piece of music ever written was a book on its shelves. But now he was standing in front of an empty shelf. He had mentally sprinted through the entire history of Western music. He started with the Baroque period, with its intricate counterpoint and mathematical precision. No, this was too wild. He moved to the classical era with its focus on balance and form. No, this was a mess. He flew through the Romantics with their emotional, passionate music. No, this wasn't passionate, it was just aggressive. He even considered the most extreme modern composers, the ones who wrote music by plucking the strings inside a piano or throwing garbage cans down a staircase. But even they had a method, a philosophy. This piece felt like it came from nowhere. It was a musical ghost. He leaned towards the other 2 judges, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Anything? The violinist just shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. The composer shrugged, looking helpless. It's brilliant, he whispered back, but it's an orphan. I have no idea where it comes from. Dr. Finch sat back in his chair, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades washing over him. Helplessness. He looked out at the audience, at the hundreds of faces waiting for him to solve the puzzle. He saw the critics in the back row, their pens poised, ready to write about his failure. He saw the host looking at him with wide, panicked eyes, silently begging him to do something. The red clock on the screen was now showing less than a minute. 0:58. 0:57. The silence was no longer just heavy. It was becoming an embarrassment. The competition, which was supposed to be a celebration of young talent, had turned into a public display of incompetence. The most brilliant minds in the room, both young and old, had been defeated by a single, mysterious piece of music. They were all, contestants and judges alike, trapped in an impasse with no way out. The moment the red clock on the screen hit 0, a collective sigh seemed to suck all the air out of the grand hall. It was the sound of a balloon slowly deflating, a long, drawn-out hiss of disappointment. The host, a man whose job was to keep the energy high, looked like a ship that had just run aground. He walked back to the center of the stage, his usual bright smile replaced by a tight, uncomfortable grimace. He tapped the microphone, but this time no one jumped. They were all too lost in the awkwardness of the moment. "Well," he began, his voice a little too loud, "it seems we have quite the enigma on our hands." He tried for a chuckle, but it died in the silence. "A piece that has stumped our brilliant finalists and even our esteemed panel of judges." He gestured towards the judges' table, where Dr. Finch was staring at his empty notepad as if it had personally insulted him. "This is, certainly an unprecedented moment in the competition's history." He was rambling now, filling the air with words because the silence was too painful to bear. He suggested that maybe the piece was a clever fake, a modern trick designed to be unidentifiable. He talked about the courage it takes to even face such a challenge. But no one was listening. The audience was looking at the 3 defeated young musicians on stage, and the judges were looking at their own hands, each of them lost in their own private world of frustration. The competition was broken. The grand finale had fizzled out into nothing, but in the front row, something was starting to stir. Clara was no longer wiggling because her dress was itchy. She was sitting perfectly still, her head cocked to one side like a little bird listening for a worm. The confusing music was still echoing inside her head, but it wasn't just a jumble of noise anymore. A tiny little thread of the melody had come loose, and she was pulling on it, trying to see where it led. It felt familiar, like a dream you can't quite remember when you wake up. It was like a word on the tip of her tongue. A face in a crowd you know you've seen before but can't place. She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out the fancy hall and the bright lights. She tried to ignore the complicated, crashy parts of the music, the parts that sounded like the angry sea. Instead, she listened for the quiet moments, the little slivers of melody that had appeared and then disappeared. And then she found it. It was a simple little pattern of 5 notes, rising and then falling. It wasn't fancy. It was plain. And it was as familiar to her as her own name. Suddenly she wasn't in the grand hall anymore. She was on a rickety wooden porch, the air thick with the smell of salt and drying fish nets. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky orange and purple. Her grandfather, a man with hands as rough as sandpaper and a laugh that sounded like gravel rattling in a tin can, was sitting next to her, carefully mending a huge net with a thick needle. He was her pop-pop. He wasn't a musician. He couldn't play the piano or read a single note. But he sang. He sang old songs, songs that his father had sung and his father before that. They were simple songs about the sea, about boats, about waiting for sailors to come home. She remembered the way he would sing this one particular tune. His voice was gravelly and off-key, but he sang it with so much feeling. He would sing it while he worked, his hands moving automatically, his eyes far away, looking out at the ocean. The lyrics were in an old, funny-sounding dialect that she didn't fully understand, but she knew the story. It was about a lighthouse keeper all alone on his rocky island, whose job was to keep the light burning for a ship that was lost in a storm. It was a sad song, but a beautiful one. And the melody was exactly the same as those 5 little notes from the strange music on stage. It was the same song. It was just dressed up in a fancy, confusing costume. Her eyes snapped open. Her heart started beating a little faster. She looked at her mom, who was sitting beside her, her face pale with worry. Her mom was staring at her brother on stage, her whole body tense with second-hand embarrassment. Clara reached out and tugged on her mom's sleeve. It was a small tug, but it was insistent. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice small but clear. Her mom didn't look at her. She just gave a little shake of her head, her eyes still glued to the stage. "Not now, sweetie," she murmured, her voice tight. Clara tugged again, a little harder this time. "But Mommy—" "Clara, please," her mom said, a hint of irritation in her voice. "This is a very important moment." To her, it was a moment of public failure for her son. She wasn't thinking about music. She was thinking about how awful he must feel, how this would crush his confidence, but Clara wasn't thinking about the competition. She was thinking about her pop-pop, who had been gone for 2 years now. Hearing his song, even in its strange, fancy form, felt like he was right there next to her. It was a gift, a surprise visit from a memory she thought was gone forever. She had to share it. "No, really," she whispered, leaning closer to her mom's ear. "I know that song. It's Pop-Pop's song." Finally, her mom turned to look at her. She was about to tell her to be quiet for the last time, but when she saw her daughter's face, she stopped. Clara's eyes were wide and bright, not with excitement, but with a strange, urgent certainty. This wasn't a child trying to get attention. This was something else. Her mom saw a flicker of her late father in that expression, the same stubborn, earnest look he would get when he was trying to explain something important. "What did you say?" her mom asked, her voice softer now. "The song," Clara said, her voice a little louder now, full of conviction. "The one they played. It's the one Pop-Pop used to sing, the one about the man in the lighthouse." Her mom stared at her. "Pop-Pop's song? The old, raspy sea shanty he used to hum while he mended his nets? It couldn't be. That music was a monster, a complex puzzle that had defeated the greatest musical minds in the country. It couldn't possibly be the same simple, forgotten tune her father used to sing, but as she looked into her daughter's serious, unwavering eyes, a tiny, impossible seed of belief began to sprout in her mind. The impasse on stage was total. The competition was a failure. Maybe, just maybe, the answer wasn't on the stage at all. Maybe it was right here, sitting in a velvet dress, bouncing a little knee in the front row. The mother sat frozen, her mind a battlefield of warring thoughts. On one side was a loud, sensible voice screaming that this was absurd. It was a ridiculous, embarrassing idea. To suggest that a simple, forgotten song sung by a fisherman could be the key to a musical puzzle that had stumped the nation's top experts. It was insane. She imagined the whispers, the pitying looks. That poor woman, so desperate for her son to win. She's putting her little girl up to this. It would be a public humiliation. A moment they would never live down. But on the other side of the battlefield was a much quieter, more persistent voice. It was the voice of her heart, and it was pointing directly at her daughter's face. She looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw not a child seeking attention, but a vessel holding a precious memory. Her eyes weren't just bright. They were glowing with a certainty that defied logic. This wasn't about the competition, or her brother, or the fancy hall. It was about Pop-Pop. It was about a connection to a man they both loved and missed, a connection that had just been unexpectedly revived through a storm of strange music. The sensible voice in her head was talking about pride and embarrassment, but her heart was talking about love and memory. And in that moment, she realized that protecting her daughter's genuine feeling was more important than protecting her own pride. The competition was already a failure. What did they have to lose? With a deep breath that felt like she was breathing in all the tension in the room, she made a decision. It was a split-second choice that felt like it took a lifetime. She leaned forward, her body tense, and scanned the edge of the stage. A young man in a black shirt stood there, looking just as panicked as the host, his hands clasped and unclasped nervously. He was a stagehand, a gatekeeper to the world on stage. She caught his eye, giving a small, sharp wave. He looked right through her at first, his gaze fixed on the disaster unfolding with the judges. She waved again, more insistently this time, her expression a mixture of urgency and apology. He finally noticed her. He frowned, confused, then gave a little shake of his head as if to say, "I can't right now." But she held his gaze and then she pointed down at Clara. who was looking up at her with complete, unwavering trust. The stagehand looked from the mother's desperate face to the little girl's earnest one, and then back to the stage where Dr. Finch was now in a hushed, angry argument with the other judges. He saw a dead end. He saw a show that was falling apart, and then he saw a tiny, crazy glimmer of a possibility. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire production, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains. The mother's heart hammered against her ribs. What had she done? She squeezed Clara's hand, which was surprisingly steady. On stage, the host was still trying to spin straw into gold, his voice growing more strained by the second. Then, the stagehand reappeared, scurrying to the host's side and whispering urgently in his ear. The host's face went through a series of rapid changes. First confusion, then annoyance. Then, as he glanced over at the front row and saw the little girl in the velvet dress, a flicker of something else. It was a mix of desperation and pure, unadulterated shock. It was the look of a drowning man who has just been thrown a very strange, very small life raft. He was a showman, and a showman knows that you can't let the audience get bored. You can't let them sit in awkward silence. You have to give them something, anything. And this was unexpected. This was drama. This was, against all odds, interesting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice suddenly regaining its confident, booming quality. A hush fell over the crowd, everyone sensing a shift in the energy. "It seems, in the most unexpected of places, we may have a potential breakthrough." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The audience stirred, craning their necks, trying to see what he was looking at. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice dropping to a more dramatic tone, "the answers to the most complex questions come from the purest of hearts." He started walking down the steps from the stage, his microphone in hand, heading directly for their aisle. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. People stood up in their seats, trying to get a better look. The cameras, which had been focused on the dejected contestants, swung around to follow the host. The mother's face felt hot. Her throat was dry. This was really happening. The host reached their row and knelt down, bringing himself to Clara's eye level. The bright camera lights followed him, making Clara squint. "Hello there," he said, his voice gentle and kind, a stark contrast to his loud stage persona. "I'm told you might know something about that music we all just heard." Clara looked up at him, then back at her mom, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. She wasn't scared anymore. She was just on a mission. She nodded back at the host. The host stood up, a look of genuine, almost childlike wonder on his face. He turned back to the audience and the stage, raising his microphone. "Well, then," he announced, his voice filled with a new kind of energy. Would the young lady please come to the stage?" A collective gasp went through the hall. This was not in the program. This was not supposed to happen. The mother gave Clara's hand one last squeeze and let go. Clara took a deep breath, just like her mom had taught her to do before she had to do something scary, and stood up. She was so small. In the vast, ornate hall, surrounded by adults, she looked like a doll that had been misplaced. She began the long walk down the aisle, a path lit by the bright, curious eyes of hundreds of strangers. She could hear the whispers, like the rustling of leaves. "Who is she? What's going on? Is that a child?" She walked slowly, her small shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. She kept her eyes fixed on the stage, on the three judges who were now staring at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The steps up to the stage were huge, and she had to lift her knee-high to climb each one. When she finally reached the top, she felt like she was on top of the world. The grand piano looked like a giant black beast, and the judges' table seemed a mile away. The host guided her gently to the center of the stage, right under the hottest spotlight. She stood there, alone, a tiny figure in a sea of expectation, with the whole world watching and waiting to hear what she had to say. The silence in the grand hall was different now. It wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of failure, but a thin, sharp silence of pure curiosity. Every single person was leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the tiny figure in the center of the stage. The spotlight felt like a physical weight, making the air around Clara shimmer. She stood there, small and alone. A stark contrast to the grand piano and the imposing judges' table that seemed to loom over her. From the audience, her mother watched with her heart in her throat, and her brother stared from his bench, a look of utter confusion on his face. Dr. Finch leaned forward, his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers. His face was a mask of stern skepticism, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, a deep, gnawing curiosity. He had spent his life in the world of formal music, of conservatories and concert halls. The idea that an answer could come from a child in the audience was absurd, yet here they were. He had to know. "Young lady," he began, his voice crisp and formal, carrying easily through the quiet hall. He wasn't being unkind, but he was being a judge. He needed to treat this seriously, to filter out any fantasy. "This is a very serious matter. We are all very interested to hear what you have to say. You claim you know this? This enigma?" Clara just nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't scared of him. He just looked like a grumpy grandpa. "And can you tell us," he continued, his tone softening almost imperceptibly, "who composed this piece?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know who composed it," she said, her voice small but clear. Like a little bell, a murmur went through the audience. The judges exchanged glances. This was what they had feared. It was just a child's imagination. Dr. Finch pressed on, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. "Then can you tell us the name of the music?" "My grandpa sang it," Clara repeated, a little more firmly this time. "He just called it The Keeper's Lament. The name meant nothing to the jury. It wasn't in any book, any catalog, any database they had ever searched. It sounded like a made-up name, a story from a fairy tale." Dr. Finch sat back, a sigh escaping his lips. It was a dead end. He was about to thank the girl and send her back to her mother, to try and salvage some dignity from the evening's disaster, but then the modern composer next to him leaned over and whispered something urgently. Dr. Finch listened, then looked back at Clara, his expression shifting. The composer had suggested that maybe the name itself was a clue, a title for a forgotten work. "Can you tell us anything else about it?" Dr. Finch asked, his voice now genuinely gentle. He was no longer a judge interrogating a contestant. He was a man desperate for a clue. Clara looked down at her shiny black shoes. She knew they didn't understand. They were thinking about composers and books and complicated things. She couldn't explain it with their words. So she decided to use her own. She took a deep breath, and instead of speaking, she began to hum. It was a simple, 5-note melody. It was the core of the storm, the little seagull flying in the sky that she had heard earlier. But this time, without all the crashing, discordant noise around it, it was different. It was plaintive and pure. It was a lonely sound. It was the sound of waiting. The melody hung in the air, so simple and so sad that it felt like a heartbreaking. The host, who was standing nearby, froze. The audience, which had been buzzing with whispers, fell completely silent. Then Clara started to sing. Her voice was high and sweet, untouched by the formal training of the other musicians. She sang the words her grandfather had taught her, in the thick, salty dialect of his remote coastal village. The language was old and strange to most of the audience, but the emotion was universal. It was the story of a man in a tall tower, whose only job was to keep a light burning. He sang of the endless waves, of the howling wind, and of a ship with a white sail that he watched for every single night, a ship that never came home. It was a song of duty, of loneliness, and of a love that never faded. As she sang, the atmosphere in the hall began to change. The famous violinist, who listened with her heart, felt a tear roll down her cheek. The song wasn't a puzzle anymore. It was a story, a human story, full of aching sadness. The modern composer's eyes widened in dawning recognition. He started scribbling furiously on his notepad, not in frustration, but in wild, ecstatic excitement. He was like a chemist who had just seen two elements combined to create something miraculous. But it was Dr. Finch who had the most profound transformation. He leaned so far forward in his chair that he was almost standing. His stern frown was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. As Clara sang the simple folk melody, his mind was frantically rewinding the complex, atonal piece they had heard earlier. He could hear it now. He could hear the keeper's lament hidden inside. It wasn't the main theme. It was a ghost. The composer of the Enigma piece had taken this old, forgotten song, broken it into 1,000 tiny pieces, and then woven those pieces into a brand new, terrifyingly complex tapestry. The angry, crashing chords weren't random. They were the storm the keeper was singing about. The weird time signatures were the rocking of the lighthouse tower in the wind. The piece wasn't a monster. It was a memory, dressed up in a monster's clothes. When Clara finished, the last note of her sweet, sad voice faded into the air. For a second there was absolute, perfect silence. Then, Dr. Finch slowly rose to his feet. The movement was so deliberate, so full of meaning, that it commanded the attention of the entire hall. "My God," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't speaking into the microphone, but his voice carried. It wasn't one piece. It was two. He looked at the other judges, who were all nodding, their faces filled with the same shock and wonder. He turned back to Clara, a look of profound respect on his face. "We were looking for a new composition. But we should have been looking for an old one." He turned to the audience, his voice now booming with the confidence of a man who had just solved the unsolvable. The Enigma was a masterpiece of musical architecture. An anonymous composer took a forgotten 18th century folk ballad, he said, gesturing to Clara, and deconstructed it. They shattered the melody and used the pieces to build a completely new structure. The chaos we heard was the storm. The little slivers of beauty were the ghost of the original song. "We weren't stumped by the music," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We were stumped by the history." The hall erupted in applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar of appreciation, a wave of sound for the little girl who had solved the puzzle with a memory. On stage, her brother was looking at her not with jealousy, but with pure, unadulterated awe. He had spent years learning the language of music, but his little sister had just shown him that the most important part of that language wasn't in the notes, but in the heart. The competition itself didn't matter anymore. There would be no first, second, or third place. Dr. Finch announced that the competition was a tie, that the true winner was the discovery itself. But everyone knew who the real hero of the night was. Clara stood there, a little overwhelmed by all the noise and the lights. She didn't fully understand what a deconstructed folk ballad was. She didn't know why the man in the suit was talking so loud. All she knew was that for a few minutes she had made the whole hall quiet, and she had shared her pop-pop song. And in that moment, the memory of her grandfather, a simple fisherman with a gravelly voice, was the most important thing in the world.